This story begins with something that sounds unbelievable. My Homeowners Association, or HOA, claimed that my motorhome was theirs and even demanded the keys. To most people, a motorhome is more than just a vehicle. It's a personal space, a home on wheels, and often holds great financial and emotional value. When I first heard their demand, I thought it was a joke. But soon, I realized the HOA was completely serious. The conflict started when the HOA noticed my motorhome parked on my property. Instead of treating it as a private belonging, they argued that it somehow fell under community property rules. They insisted it was against their regulations and went so far as to say they had rights to it. To make matters worse, they formally demanded I hand over the keys, acting like they had authority to seize it. This shocking claim set the stage for a long and stressful battle. What began as a simple misunderstanding quickly turned into a fight for my personal rights and property. From that moment, I knew I wasn't just defending a motorhome. I was standing up against an HOA abusing its power. The HOA's claim. The heart of this strange conflict lies in the claim the HOA made about my motorhome. To understand the full picture, you need to know that HOAs often enforce rules about property appearance, parking, and community standards. Normally, this means making sure lawns are trimmed, houses are painted in certain colors, or that vehicles are not parked in certain areas. But in my case, the HOA went far beyond their usual boundaries. They actually claimed ownership of my motorhome. It began with a letter slipped into my mailbox. The HOA board stated that my motorhome was community property because it was parked within the association's boundaries. They said it violated neighborhood rules and regulations, and because of this, they had the authority to take possession of it. In simple words, they were saying, "Your motorhome doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to us." When I read that letter, I was in disbelief. A motorhome is not a garden gnome or a lawn ornament. It is legally registered with the DMV and comes with a title, just like a house deed or a car title. But the HOA ignored all of that. They claimed the motorhome was left abandoned on association property, even though it was clearly parked on my own driveway, right outside my house. The HOA board members backed up their claim by quoting vague sections of the community bylaws. They pointed to rules about prohibited vehicles and abandoned property. According to their interpretation, because my motorhome was not in use every day, they could classify it as abandoned. Then, using this twisted logic, they said they had the right to seize it. It didn't stop there. They demanded that I turn over the keys immediately so they could remove it for the benefit of the community. They warned that if I refused, they would escalate the matter with fines, towing, and even legal action. Their language was intimidating, filled with official-sounding terms, as if they were certain their claim would stand up in court. But anyone who understands property law could see through their bluff. Ownership of a motorhome is proven by title and registration, not by where it is parked or how often it is driven. The HOA's argument was nothing more than a stretch of their power, an attempt to bully me into giving up my rights. The more I read their letters and listened to their demands, the clearer it became this was not about rules. It was about control. The HOA board wanted to show that they could enforce their authority in extreme ways even when it wasn't legal. This claim didn't just anger me, it scared me too. If they could take my motorhome, what would stop them from trying to take other personal belongings? That's when I decided I had no choice but to fight back. Why the motorhome was important. To understand why I fought so hard against the HOA, you first need to know what the motorhome meant to me. It wasn't just a big vehicle sitting on my driveway. It was something deeply personal and valuable, both financially and emotionally. For starters, a motorhome is a major investment. It's not cheap, and for many people, it represents years of savings and careful planning. Mine was fully paid for, registered in my name, and insured. Losing it would have meant losing tens of thousands of dollars. The idea that the HOA thought they could just claim it as their own was outrageous, almost like someone walking into your house and declaring it belonged to them. But beyond money, the motorhome carried special memories. I had taken countless trips in it, weekend getaways with friends, road trips across state lines, and even family vacations where we bonded around campfires. Every dent, scratch, and souvenir inside told a story. To me, it wasn't just metal and wheels, it was a moving scrapbook of my life experiences. That made the HOA's demand even more insulting. They weren't just targeting property, they were trying to erase a piece of my personal history. The motorhome also served a practical purpose. It was my backup living space. In times when life got tough, I knew I could always rely on it. If my house needed repairs or if emergencies struck, the motorhome gave me a sense of security. Knowing I had a roof, a bed, and a kitchen on wheels meant peace of mind. In fact, during one particularly tough winter storm, the motorhome was the only place I could stay warm when the power went out in my house. That kind of safety net is priceless. And another important factor was independence. Owning a motorhome gave me freedom to travel anywhere without worrying about hotel bookings or flight schedules. It symbolized a lifestyle of choice, being able to pack up and go whenever I wanted. The HOA trying to take it away felt like they were not only stealing property, but stripping me of my freedom. On top of all this, I knew that if I gave in to their demand, it would set a dangerous precedent. Today, it was the motorhome. Tomorrow, it could be anything else they didn't like. Standing my ground wasn't just about protecting the motorhome. It was about protecting my rights as a homeowner and an individual. So when the HOA said they wanted my keys, I didn't see it as a simple argument about parking rules. I saw it as a direct attack on something that represented my money, my memories, my freedom, and my security. That's why I refused to hand it over, no matter how much pressure they applied. Giving up would have meant losing far more than a vehicle. It would have meant losing control of my life. HOA pressure tactics. Once the HOA realized I wasn't going to hand over the keys to my motorhome voluntarily, they escalated their efforts. What started as letters quickly turned into a series of aggressive tactics meant to wear me down. Their goal was simple: intimidate me until I surrendered. The first tactic was constant written warnings. Every week I received letters in the mail or taped to my door. These letters accused me of breaking community rules, threatened fines, and repeated their demand for the keys. The language was always formal and heavy-handed, filled with legal-sounding terms designed to scare me. They wanted me to believe that I had no choice but to obey. Next came financial threats. The HOA claimed that if I didn't comply, they would fine me daily until the motorhome was gone. They listed outrageous amounts, sometimes hundreds of dollars a week. The hope was that the fear of mounting debt would push me into submission. But I knew these fines had no legal ground since the motorhome was mine and legally parked on my own property. Still, the constant financial threats were stressful. Then they turned to public pressure. Board members started bringing up my motorhome during community meetings, painting me as a rule breaker who refused to follow the neighborhood standards. They tried to turn neighbors against me, suggesting that my motorhome lowered property values or made the area look bad. It was a classic tactic, using social shame to force compliance. At one point, they even threatened towing.
I found notes on my windshield warning that if I didn't surrender the vehicle, they would arrange for it to be removed. This was especially bold since the motorhome was legally titled and parked on my own driveway, not on community land. Still, the threat of waking up one morning and finding it gone was always in the back of my mind. When intimidation alone didn't work, the HOA tried to confuse me with paperwork. They sent copies of bylaws, highlighted sections that they claimed supported their argument, and buried me in long, complicated documents. It was an attempt to overwhelm me, to make me feel like maybe they were right and I was wrong. But after carefully reading through everything, I realized they were twisting vague rules about abandoned property and applying them where they clearly didn't fit. The most personal tactic was when the HOA members showed up at my house in person. On more than one occasion, board members knocked on my door and
Preparing for the legal battle. Once it became clear that the HOA wasn't going to stop, I realized I had no choice but to prepare for a legal fight. This wasn't just about protecting my motorhome anymore. It was about defending my rights as a homeowner against an association that thought it could twist rules to its advantage. Preparing for that battle required strategy, patience, and careful organization. The first step was gathering all necessary paperwork. I collected every document that proved ownership of the motorhome, the title, registration, and insurance papers. I made copies and organized them neatly in a folder. These papers were the backbone of my case, hard evidence that the motorhome was mine and mine alone. I also gathered proof that it was parked legally on my property, including photographs, utility bills with my address, and even property maps. The goal was to leave no room for doubt. Next, I compiled a timeline of events. From the very first letter the HOA sent me to the most recent threats, I wrote everything down. I included dates, times, and details of each encounter. Alongside this, I saved every letter, notice, and email they had sent me. I also printed screenshots of text messages and took pictures of warning notes taped to my motorhome. By the end, I had a thick file of evidence showing a clear pattern of harassment and intimidation. With my evidence secured, I decided to consult a lawyer. I reached out to an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. During our first meeting, I laid out my documents and explained the situation. To my relief, the lawyer confirmed that the HOA had no legal authority to seize or claim ownership of my motorhome. Their arguments about abandoned property were baseless, and their demands for the keys were completely out of line. Hearing that from a professional gave me confidence that I was standing on solid ground. The lawyer also helped me develop a legal strategy. We planned to focus on 3 main points: ownership proof, showing the court that I held the legal title and registration, property rights, demonstrating that the motorhome was parked on my own property, not on shared or community land, and HOA overreach, proving that the HOA had abused its authority by making false claims and harassing me. At the same time, I prepared myself mentally. Legal battles can be long, draining, and stressful. I knew the HOA would try to paint me as a troublemaker, but I was determined to remain calm and professional throughout the process. I rehearsed my side of the story, focusing on the facts instead of emotions. Finally, I secured witnesses. A few neighbors had seen the HOA board members confronting me or leaving threatening notes. They agreed to testify if needed. Their support added credibility to my case. By the time the court date approached, I was ready. My evidence was solid, my lawyer was confident, and I felt prepared to face the HOA head-on. What had started as an outrageous demand for my motorhome had turned into a legal showdown, and I was determined to win. The courtroom showdown. When the court date finally arrived, I knew it was the moment everything had been building toward.
For weeks, the HOA had bullied, threatened, and tried to intimidate me into handing over my motorhome. Now it was time to put the facts on the table and let the law decide. Walking into the courtroom, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. On one side of the room sat the HOA board members, looking confident, as if victory was guaranteed. They had hired an attorney and carried thick binders, trying to appear organized and official. On my side, I sat with my lawyer and a folder of carefully prepared evidence, titles, photos, letters, and witness statements. I reminded myself that the truth was on my side. The hearing began with the HOA's attorney presenting their case. Their argument centered on the claim that my motorhome violated community rules and therefore could be considered abandoned property. They leaned heavily on vague sections of the HOA bylaws, twisting phrases to fit their narrative. They also tried to paint me as an uncooperative neighbor who refused to follow community standards. At one point, they even suggested that my motorhome was lowering property values in the neighborhood. When it was our turn, my lawyer calmly dismantled their arguments piece by piece. First, he presented the title and registration documents, proving beyond any doubt that I was the legal owner of the motorhome. Then he showed photos of it parked on my driveway, clearly within the boundaries of my property, not on any shared or community land. Next, he turned the spotlight on the HOA's tactics. He presented copies of the threatening letters and notices they had sent me. The judge raised an eyebrow as he read through the language, some of which clearly overstepped their authority. My lawyer pointed out how the HOA had repeatedly ignored state property laws in favor of their own misinterpretations of bylaws. To strengthen our case, we also introduced witness testimony. A neighbor confirmed seeing HOA board members leave notes on my motorhome and heard them demanding my keys. Another testified that the motorhome was never abandoned. It was maintained, insured, and used. Their statements made it clear that the HOA story didn't match reality. Throughout the hearing, the judge asked pointed questions. He wanted clarification on where exactly the motorhome was parked and whether the HOA had any legal ownership rights. Each time, the HOA's attorney struggled to provide a solid answer. Their case, which had looked intimidating at first, quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Finally, my lawyer summed up. The motorhome was legally mine, it was parked on my private property, and the HOA had no authority to demand the keys, seize it, or interfere with it in any way. He emphasized that this was not just a property dispute, but an example of an HOA abusing its power. As the arguments ended, I could feel the tension in the room. The HOA members looked less confident now, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of relief. Whatever the outcome, I knew we had presented the truth clearly and firmly. This showdown wasn't just about a motorhome, it was about standing up against overreach. And as the judge prepared to deliver his decision, I could already sense that the tide was turning in my favor. The judge's decision. After both sides had presented their arguments, the courtroom grew quiet. Everyone was waiting for the judge's ruling. For me, this was the most nerve-wracking part of the entire ordeal. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, preparing my case, and standing up to the HOA's intimidation. And now, everything came down to one person's decision. The judge began by summarizing what he had heard. He acknowledged the HOA's claim that the motorhome violated community rules and their insistence that it could be classified as abandoned property. He also pointed out how the HOA tried to justify its authority using vague sections of the bylaws. However, the judge made it clear that the HOA had a heavy burden to prove that their claim extended to actual ownership of my motorhome. Then the judge turned to the evidence my lawyer and I had presented. He reviewed the title, registration, and insurance documents, all of which were in my name. He examined the photos showing the motorhome parked squarely on my driveway, well within the boundaries of my property. He even looked through the stack of letters and notices the HOA had sent me, noting how aggressive and threatening their language was. At this point, the judge's tone shifted. He firmly stated that ownership of a motorhome is established through legal title, not HOA bylaws. No matter how the association tried to interpret their rules, they could not override state law. He also emphasized that my motorhome was not abandoned. It was maintained, insured, and used. The HOA's argument, he said, was a clear example of overreach. Then came the decisive words. The judge ruled in my favor. He declared that the motorhome was my private property and that the HOA had no legal right to demand the keys, seize it, or interfere with it in any way. He even warned the HOA that their actions bordered on harassment and misuse of authority. The relief I felt in that moment is hard to describe. Weeks of stress, intimidation, and sleepless nights lifted off my shoulders. I had not only kept my motorhome, but also stood up to a powerful association and won. The look on the faces of the HOA board members said it all. They had expected to intimidate me into defeat, but instead their case collapsed under the weight of the law. The judge ended the hearing by reminding the HOA of their actual role: to manage community standards fairly, not to abuse power or invent ownership claims. His words were a clear rebuke, and they left the HOA with no room to argue further. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt vindicated. I had defended my rights, protected my property, and shown that even against an entire association, one person